Before we begin, do you have a theory about this case or a story of your own? Leave a message on our socials. Our handles are all just Nightwatch Files without the space, or head over to nightwatchfiles.com to find them all in one place. Your insights might be featured in a future episode. I'm Harper Finley, and this is Nightwatch Files. Quick note, if you enjoy the show and want to support it continuing, we have a Patreon that goes for just $3 a month, which is less than a coffee. You'll get ad-free access to every episode, and your support helps us add more perks in the future. Whether you want to help keep the show going or just prefer listening without ads, you can find the link in the episode description. Now, let's get into today's case. On the evening of August 18, 2012, Nancy Howard attended a baptism service at her church in Carrollton, Texas. She arrived at 6 o'clock, entering through the south door as she always did. Security cameras captured her car pulling into the parking lot. In the footage, a silver Nissan Altima could be seen following her in and parking in the same lot. Within seconds of Nancy entering the building, the silver car drove out of the parking lot, only to return at 6:55 and park in the north corner. A person got out of the vehicle, walked to the men's restroom, and returned to the car 4 minutes later, apparently content to wait. The baptism ceremony concluded at 7:25 with a brief reception. At 7:26 and 40 seconds, security footage captured Nancy leaving the church, walking to her car, and exiting the parking lot. 17 seconds later, the silver car pulled out and followed her into the misty evening. Nancy stopped at a Taco Bueno to pick up dinner before pulling into her driveway. As she opened the garage door and got out of her car to gather her purse and food, someone grabbed her from behind by the neck and demanded her purse. The stocky-looking man wore a dark baseball cap and black-rimmed glasses. In her flustered state, she handed him the bag of tacos instead of her purse. He swore and demanded it again. Nancy thrust her purse at his chest while crying out, "Jesus, save me." In response, he shot her in the head. The bullet exploded directly over her left eye. Nancy Shore met Frank Howard and eventually became his second wife. Frank's full name was John Franklin Howard, and he carried the weight of a failed first marriage. Right after high school, he had married a woman named Marcy, who he described as his best friend and lover. But Frank admitted he royally screwed up time after time, eventually letting go of his wife and running away for several years. When Nancy and Frank married, she was very young and immature in her thinking about love and marriage. She moved directly from her parents' home into the home she would share with Frank. Her father had died suddenly on a Christmas weekend, 17 years before the events that would later unfold, leaving a void that Frank's father, a retired Baptist minister, would help fill. From the start, Nancy's commitment to Frank's future was absolute. They cut their honeymoon short so he could finish his college degree requirements. Nancy worked for the first few years of their marriage, but when the children started school, she stopped working full-time at Frank's request, becoming what she called a domestic engineer, a professional homemaker who managed the household and family calendar. For many months, they both made sacrifices while Frank studied for his CPA licensing exam. They viewed his career as a partnership. Over time, Frank built a reputation as a man of unimpeachable character, an upstanding businessman, a strong Christian, and a devoted family man. He became an active member of the largest Baptist church in Carrollton, serving in youth ministry and singing in the choir alongside Nancy. Their life together was deeply integrated with their faith. They had agreed before marrying that God would be the head of their household. They attended services whenever the doors were open and were committed to raising their children to know the Lord and represent Him well. They attended parenting classes together and were deeply involved in their children's activities, sports, theater, and music. The family even hosted 2 foreign exchange students to broaden their children's worldview. Frank became known as the master of surprises, creating elaborate and thoughtful experiences for Nancy and their family. Around 2001, for Nancy's 40th birthday, he orchestrated a spectacular surprise trip to Alaska. He told her to pack for both cold and warm weather and arranged for her mother, Eleanor, to watch the children. The week-long cruise began in Vancouver, and Nancy would later recall the breathtaking glaciers and watching a whale breach. In Juneau, Frank insisted on buying her an expensive ring she had been drawn to, overriding her objections about the cost. As Nancy approached her 45th birthday, she wondered if Frank would still plan a special surprise for her. The surprise that year came in a casual moment. Frank tossed an envelope on the kitchen table on his way to work, wished her an early birthday, and kissed her head. Inside the envelope was a card in her favorite color, purple, and 2 tickets to a Barry Manilow concert. Nancy viewed the gift as a sacrifice. She knew Frank was not a fan of Manilow's music, yet he had paid a significant amount for the tickets. She hoped he would use the second ticket to go with her. The concert itself was exciting, but Nancy later described the drive home as even more memorable. They sang Manilow songs together, then joined their voices to harmonize on a hymn they were preparing for the church choir. Nancy was flooded by memories of singing together. It became a special night she would always remember. Then came the summer of 2008. At dinner one evening, Frank announced he was taking their entire family of 5, along with his own parents, to the Olympics in Beijing. Nancy was astounded, wondering how they could afford it. Frank revealed he had been saving for months and had already made all the arrangements: flights, hotels, and event tickets. There had been difficult periods. For about 4 years, Nancy battled fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue, a rough time for both of them. But they had navigated it together, and it seemed temporary, just another challenge overcome in what Nancy described as a very strong relationship and a great marriage. Nancy had 2 brothers, an oldest brother whose church she had spoken at, and a youngest brother. Both of Nancy's names, first and middle, meant grace. Frank had an older brother who lived in Ponder, Texas. His parents had been alive and well enough to travel to Beijing with the family in 2008. For nearly 30 years, this was the life Nancy and Frank Howard had built together. Quick break. Ads keep the show running, but if you want to skip them, the ad-free version's on Patreon for just $3 a month. Links in the show notes. And we're back. Thanks for sticking through that. Let's get back to it. On the morning of August 18, 2012, Frank Howard was in California on a business trip when he sent an email to Nancy at 10:39 a.m. explaining that a car sale had fallen through and he'd decided to stay over until Monday to ride back on the plane with Richard Raley, his wealthy client and employer. He ended the message with, "I love you and can't wait to get home to you." While Frank was thousands of miles away, Nancy spent her day hosting 2 tables at a women's tea at her church in Carrollton, Texas. An ordinary Saturday filled with the kind of church activities that had defined her life for nearly 3 decades. When evening came, Nancy arrived at the church at 6 p.m. for a service and the baptism of a friend's daughter, entering through the south door as she always did. Security cameras captured her car pulling into the parking lot, and in the footage, a silver vehicle, later identified as a Nissan Altima, could be seen following her in and parking in the same lot. Within seconds of Nancy entering the building, the silver car drove out of the parking lot, only to return at 6:55 p.m. and park in the north corner. A person got out of the vehicle, walked to the men's restroom, and returned to the car 4 minutes later at 6:59 p.m., apparently content to wait. The baptism ceremony concluded at 7:25 p.m. with a brief reception where a photograph was taken of Nancy smiling with her friends. At 7:26 p.m., security footage captured her leaving the church, walking to her car, and exiting the parking lot, completely unaware that just 17 seconds later, the silver car would pull out and follow her into the misty evening. Too busy to eat at the reception, Nancy stopped at a Taco Bueno on her way home to pick up dinner before pulling into her driveway through the fine mist that had begun to fall. As she opened the garage door and got out of her car to gather her purse and food, someone grabbed her from behind by the neck and demanded her purse. The stocky-looking man wore a dark baseball cap and black-rimmed glasses, and Nancy's first confused thought was that it must be some kind of prank, until she turned and saw the silver handgun aimed at her head. In her flustered state, she handed him the bag of tacos instead of her purse, prompting him to swear and demand it again. Nancy thrust her purse at his chest while crying out, "Jesus, save me," and in response, he shot her in the head, the bullet exploding directly over her left eye. When Nancy became aware of her surroundings again, she found herself lying partially across a recycle bin, hearing a voice commanding her to get up. She managed to pull herself to a standing position, but the floor had become so slick with her blood that it was impossible to keep her footing. Desperate for help, she resorted to belly crawling to her car to press the OnStar medical alert button, only to discover it wouldn't work because the key was in her stolen purse. Fearing her attacker might still be in the driveway, Nancy hit the button to close the garage door before staggering through her own blood to get inside the house, where she somehow managed to disarm the security system despite her injuries. In the bathroom, she caught sight of her gruesome image in the mirror and grabbed a towel to try to stop the bleeding before shuffling to the kitchen to dial 911 on the landline. The dispatcher, Dusty, stayed calm as Nancy gasped for breath and gurgled blood in her throat, managing to give her name, location, and a description of the shooter. Dusty promised to stay on the line and asked Nancy to make her way to the front door to unlock it, where she sat in a chair in the foyer to wait for help. When Nancy saw a hand holding a gun through the glass pane of the door, she panicked until Dusty reassured her it was a police officer, and when she finally opened the door, she fell into the officer's arms. Then around midnight in Grand Saline, Michael Lawrence returned home to his fiancée, Misty Ford, uncharacteristically quiet. He tells her that he had murdered somebody, a female, and that he shot her in her garage in the forehead. In the summer of 2009, Nancy and her younger daughter traveled to Zambia with their church on a mission trip, working with orphaned children who had lost their parents to AIDS. The experience was profound for Nancy, particularly when the church team prayed over a little girl named Anelis, who they believed seemed to be demon-possessed and was subsequently healed. The experience solidified for Nancy the power in the name of Jesus. While Nancy was in Africa in mid-July 2009, Frank Howard met Suzanne Leonteff at a casino in Lake Tahoe. Suzanne, a dental hygienist from California, was in Tahoe for her daughter's softball tournament. Their relationship developed very quickly, and they spent the following weekend together. When Nancy and her daughter returned to DFW Airport, Frank was waiting for them. As they shared stories of their trip, Frank began to sob uncontrollably, something Nancy had never seen before. He told them that a very close family friend had died suddenly from an aneurysm. While Nancy shared his grief, she found his dramatic reaction to be out of character. Shortly after meeting Suzanne, in August 2009, Frank began creating shadow companies and bank accounts, some named after her, by combining her name with Tahoe, Sudaho. A few months after Nancy's return from Africa, Frank informed her he had taken on a new wealthy client named Richard Rayleigh, whose work would require frequent and extensive travel. Nancy was uneasy because Frank had made this major life-changing decision without consulting her, which was contrary to how they had always operated. Frank's work for Rayleigh soon evolved into a chief financial officer position. That fall, Nancy noticed a distinct change in Frank's behavior. His business trips became increasingly frequent and prolonged, and he began attending numerous sporting events with the guys, which was out of character for him. Nancy began to feel like a single woman and came to hate Frank's suitcase, viewing it as a symbol of the mistress that had stolen my husband. At the time, she believed this other woman was his work for Richard Rayleigh. For Frank's 50th birthday in the fall of 2009, Nancy planned an elaborate surprise, giving him 50 small things each day for the 50 days leading up to his birthday. For the days he was traveling, she would pack the items into his suitcase. The constant travel made it impossible for Nancy to plan any date nights, leading to an angry confrontation where she hurled a calendar across the room. On one rare occasion when they attended a Chicago concert together, Nancy tried to sing to Frank, but he shook his head in disgust, a response she noted still hurts. Nancy began going to marriage counseling by herself, and Frank later agreed to join her. During one session, the counselor bluntly asked Frank if he was having an affair, to which he gave a resounding no. Counseling led to a temporary pause in Frank's travel when, at the counselor's suggestion, he got a medical checkup that Nancy insisted on attending. The checkup revealed he had prostate cancer, requiring several months of daily radiation treatments. Forced to stay in town, Frank seemed less aloof and more attentive, and Nancy was determined to walk the journey with him. In early 2010, while undergoing cancer treatment and marriage counseling, Frank made his first contact with a convict named Billy Earl Johnson. Using his first name, John, as an alias, Frank called Billy and said he was looking for someone to do a job. When Billy asked what kind of job, Frank replied, "Kill my wife." Billy, thinking it might be a joke, told John to call him back when he had $60,000. A few days later, Frank called again, and they agreed to meet at a Western wear store in Mesquite, Texas. At this meeting, Frank handed Billy a manila envelope containing $60,000 in cash, a photograph of Nancy, and a copy of her driver's license. Frank's instructions were to make it look like an accident. Billy and his girlfriend, Stacy Serenko, quickly spent the money on drugs and shopping. In October 2010, Stacy Serenko made an early attempt to expose the plot. She spoke with a Sergeant White and another law enforcement officer about what was taking place. However, she became frightened, feeling that the officers did not believe her story. When Billy was released from jail shortly thereafter, she froze and did not follow through with her report. Frank continued to make numerous wire transfers and cash payments to Billy Earl Johnson and his associates throughout this period. Billy's strategy was not to carry out the murder, but to keep the money coming from Frank. To give Frank some assurance that he was working on the job, Billy would drive to locations where Frank said Nancy would be, such as her book club meetings in Louisville or Allen. Frank provided Billy with the addresses and instructed him to take her out, adding that it didn't make any difference if her friends got caught in it as well. In the summer of 2010, Stacy Serenko and Billy Earl followed Nancy to an office complex where she was attending a meeting to plan a fundraiser for a mission organization. They sat waiting for her for many hours, during which time Billy slashed Nancy's tires. Their plan was thwarted when a friend came to pick Nancy up. While funding the plot to have her killed, Frank made several gestures that convinced Nancy they were working to salvage their relationship. In the summer of 2011, in a surprising move, Frank agreed to join Nancy and their younger daughter on another church mission trip to Zambia. Nancy noted that on the trip, Frank seemed to enjoy working with the young boys and with our daughter. During this trip, they had a conversation with another couple who suggested that taking up a new hobby together, like dancing lessons, was a good way for empty nesters to reconnect. When they returned home, Nancy asked Frank if he would be willing to take dancing lessons, and to her surprise, he said yes. They enrolled in a class for dancing in the round, which is similar to square dancing, but involves dancing with the same partner. Nancy discovered that Frank, the methodical CPA, was a much better dancer than she was and was very good at keeping up with the steps. Frank enjoyed the classes so much that he made a significant change to his work life to accommodate them. For every Tuesday night until the class ended in July 2012, Frank arranged his travel schedule so that he could leave for his trips on Wednesdays and be home on Monday nights, ensuring he would never miss their dance class. This sustained effort further convinced Nancy that he was committed to their marriage. In January 2012, Jennifer Northcutt, a friend of hitman Billy Earl Johnson's daughter, was serving a sentence on a federal drug charge when she told a DEA agent named Daniel Morgan that Billy was receiving money from someone named John to kill his wife. She even drew a map for the agent showing the back of the Howard house where money was picked up from a meter box. However, with only the first name John and a general description, there was not enough information for law enforcement to launch a full investigation at that time. That spring, inspired by a sermon, Nancy asked Frank if they could read scriptures and pray together in the mornings. Frank agreed, and for a few weeks they started their days this way, sharing thoughts on devotionals, even when he was traveling. However, this practice gradually stopped, as Frank claimed his early meetings began to interrupt this special form of communication. On April 19, 2012, following a suggestion from Billy Johnson to cover their tracks, Frank obtained a prepaid phone that would later connect him to many of the conspirators. In May 2012, Frank's mistress, Suzanne Leontieff, began to pressure him intensely to end his marriage. On May 7th, she sent him a text giving an ultimatum. "I'm so sick of being alone. You need to file for divorce by this Friday or move on. I have waited long enough. Heard all the same bullshit for 3 years. It is now or never. Your choice." On May 30th, she sent another text accusing him of being defensive and hiding something. "Now is the time for you to grow up and deal with your shit one way or another." Around this time, Frank and Nancy celebrated their anniversary at a bed and breakfast from May 20th to 21st, 2012. This was the only period when there were no calls from his prepaid phone to the East Texas criminals. In late May 2012, the plot shifted significantly when Frank met Billy Earl's nephew, Michael Speck, at a Bass Pro Shop. A new plan was formed to kill Nancy in San Marcos at her mother's house. The San Marcos plan was set to take place in early June, but it was thwarted when Billy Earl Johnson and his girlfriend, Stacy Serenko, were arrested in Denton County. With Billy sidelined, Frank made it clear the plan would now move forward with Michael Speck, stating in a recorded jailhouse call with Billy, "I'm all in with Michael," signaling that he was finished dealing with Billy. On June 30th, 2012, Michael Speck stopped communicating with Frank. The very next day, July 1st, 2012, Dustin Hirams, Stacy Serenko's son, began receiving money from Frank to carry out the murder. 3 days later, on July 4th, Dustin met Jason Rendine and Stephanie Della Cerda and told them about the murder-for-hire plot, giving them thousands of dollars in cash. A few days after their meeting, Dustin and Jason drove to Carrollton and were stopped by police in Nancy's neighborhood for suspicious activity. A high Dustin told the officers he was a hitman looking for a man named John to pick up money, but they did not believe his story. After learning the details of the plot from Dustin, Jason and Stephanie began a blackmail scheme, contacting Frank and threatening to go to the police. Over the next several weeks, Frank paid them tens of thousands of dollars in cash and wire transfers to keep them quiet. During this time, Frank also asked them if they knew anyone who could take care of it. In July 2012, the weekly dancing lessons that Frank and Nancy had been attending since the previous summer came to an end. Frank told Dustin Hirams that an ideal location for the hit would be the Gaylord, Texas Hotel, where Nancy would be attending a conference from August 8th to 11th, 2012. Frank specified that Dustin should use a bat or a knife, not a gun, to avoid attracting attention. While Nancy was at the conference, Frank called and asked for her room number, which she gave him, thinking he might send her flowers as a romantic gesture. On August 11th, 2012, the last day of the conference, Michael Speck re-established contact with Frank, just 7 days before the shooting would take place. Quick break. Ads keep the show running, but if you want to skip them, the ad-free version's on Patreon for just $3 a month. Links in the show notes. And we're back. Thanks for sticking through that. Let's get back to it. Nancy was admitted to the trauma center at Parkland Hospital under a false name due to the criminal nature of her case. Doctors determined she had extensive head damage, damaged nerves, a fractured rib, neck fractures, and a collapsed lung, with the bullet lodged in her right lung. Surgeons worked to repair torn flesh around her eye, sinuses, throat, and hard palate. Nancy was placed in the ICU with a breathing tube down her throat and a cervical collar, her hands tied down to prevent her from pulling out the tube, while she endured hourly neurological tests and endless rounds of medication. Frank arrived at the hospital after being called by one of his daughters. He sat by Nancy's bedside, whispering, "Honey, we're going to get through this together," which gave Nancy hope that their marriage could be strengthened by the crisis. On August 20th, 2 days after the shooting, Frank delivered devastating news. Nancy's eye had been destroyed by the bullet and would need to be surgically removed. A surgeon performed the removal, noting the trauma was so severe it was difficult to distinguish tissue from the eye itself. After being missing from the hospital for a day, Frank called Nancy on August 21st, 3 days after the shooting. On this call, he did not say he was on his way to see her, but instead admitted to having an affair that had lasted almost 3 years. This confession was prompted not by guilt, but by necessity. Police detectives had seized computers and cell phones and quickly discovered emails, photos, and bank records revealing his long-term involvement with Suzanne Leontieff in California. While Nancy remained in the hospital, police investigated the crime scene and Frank's activities, uncovering evidence of the affair, the embezzlement of millions from Richard Raley to finance it, and bank transactions connecting Frank to a shady family of criminals led by Billy Earl Johnson. About 6 days after the shooting, detectives informed Nancy they had substantial evidence to arrest Frank on suspicion of murder for hire. A couple of days later, on August 26th, Frank was arrested and jailed, an event that fueled a massive flurry of media attention due to his reputation as an upstanding Christian businessman and devoted family man. The family was thrown into a roller coaster of conflicting news and emotions, including false reports that Frank had confessed to the charge. After Frank's arrest, the threat to Nancy's life was considered very real. Doctors cleared her to move from the hospital to a rehabilitation facility, the location of which was kept confidential. The move happened suddenly. She was taken by ambulance with no phone and no way to contact anyone, causing her great anxiety. In rehab, Nancy spent 3 hours a day in painful physical therapy to regain movement in her right arm and to learn to function with one eye. She also underwent cognitive therapy for brain retraining. The emotional trauma was severe. When weights fell in the therapy room, the loud noise frightened her so badly that her knees buckled and she collapsed, weeping. While Nancy was in rehab, Frank's family and bookkeeper solicited letters of support for his bail hearing, which was attended by over 60 people. At the hearing, the lead detective laid out the evidence, testifying that Frank, using the alias John, had contacted convict Billy Earl Johnson in early 2010, paid him $60,000 to kill Nancy and make it look like an accident, and continued to make payments to Billy and his associates for years. The detective also revealed Frank's suggestion that the hit take place at the Gaylord, Texas hotel. The judge upheld the $1 million bail, and Frank was released after paying $150,000. He was required to wear an ankle monitor and stay away from Nancy and their house. With Frank facing both criminal charges and a civil lawsuit from Richard Raley for embezzlement, Nancy's lawyer recommended she file for divorce to protect her financial health and freeze their community property assets. To make it clear the filing was not an expression of belief in his guilt, she included a specific statement. "The decision to file for divorce does not express a conviction of my husband's guilt in the manner of criminal solicitation, but is the required response to my husband's infidelity and deception where our joint finances are involved." After over a month since the shooting, Nancy's progress was sufficient for outpatient therapy, but detectives warned her that returning to the crime scene was still dangerous and advised her to move to a secret location known only to a few close family members and friends. She moved in with her youngest brother and her mother, Eleanor. Nancy's first full day out of rehab involved a court hearing in Denton for the divorce proceedings. Dressing herself was a challenge, and applying makeup with only one eye was a comical struggle. At the courthouse, she saw Frank with his parents and lawyers. A temporary compromise was reached on separating their assets, with Nancy receiving the Carrollton house and Frank being responsible for the properties in California and Lake Tahoe. The hearing was widely covered by the media. At the end of September, Nancy made her first visit back to her church, accompanied by her daughter, son-in-law, and mother. They arrived late and sat in the back, but at the end of the service, the pastor announced her presence. She was surrounded by well-wishers, but the hugs and pats on the shoulder were excruciatingly painful due to extensive nerve damage. Though she had possession of the house, Nancy was terrified to return, especially to the garage. Her trauma counselor gave her exercises to overcome her fear. Her mother drove her to the house, where Nancy repeatedly walked toward the driveway until her anxiety subsided, then opened the garage door to look inside, and finally forced herself to walk into the spot where she was shot until she began hyperventilating. This exhausting process was a necessary step in her emotional healing. As 2013 began, Nancy's days were consumed by agonizing physical therapy for her damaged right arm and twice-weekly massage sessions. Her prosthetic eye proved problematic, frequently dislodging from the socket. The doctor determined she would need a new prosthetic fabricated before any surgical intervention could proceed. The question of divorce weighed heavily on Nancy's mind. She feared that finalizing the separation might damage Frank's legal defense, or worse, that she could lose custody of her children, who still adored their father. But the deciding factor wasn't emotional. It was the stark financial reality that only a divorce could protect what remained of her assets. She made the calls to each of her children, explaining that their father's own choices had led to this outcome. The children understood intellectually, but emotionally, they were devastated. Frank's response to the divorce filing was unexpected. Through his attorney, he requested reconciliation counseling. Nancy saw through it immediately. This was a delay tactic designed to postpone the divorce proceedings until after his criminal trial concluded. In mid-February, just days before her 52nd birthday, Nancy spoke at her oldest brother's church, giving her first public testimony about what had happened. On February 19th, she posted to Facebook, expressing gratitude to God for saving her life and thanking those who had supported her through the nightmare. Nancy had made arrangements to meet Dusty, the 911 dispatcher who had stayed on the line with her during those terrifying minutes after the shooting. When she listened to the 5-minute recording of the call, she was transported back to that morning. The fear, the pain, the desperation. She learned that Dusty had been voted Dispatcher of the Year. Nancy was invited to present the award at an upcoming banquet. On March 21, 2013, a grand jury handed down an indictment against Frank Howard, 6 counts of criminal solicitation, 2 counts of attempted capital murder. Nancy felt profound grief. Despite everything, she was still in love with the man she had married. With the indictment, the evidence became public record. Nancy could now share details with her children. She told them about the text message Frank had sent just minutes after the shooting. A single word: status. She told them how he had suggested the attack take place at the Gaylord, Texas hotel, and how he had proposed using a bat or a knife. Her older daughter refused to accept it. She remained adamant that these allegations would be disproved at trial. Media outlets began calling. Nancy agreed to an interview with a local television station, which produced a segment about her story as part of a report on domestic violence. She believed it was God's will when she agreed to speak with Dateline NBC. The production process stretched across several months. The crew filmed in Carrollton, then traveled to New York to interview her daughters, who appeared on camera defending their father. At the end of March, Nancy underwent a 3-hour surgery to rebuild the orbital floor beneath her damaged eye. The injury was more extensive than the surgeons had anticipated. The first days of recovery were excruciating. 4 days later, on Easter morning, she was still too weak to attend church in person. She watched the service online, reflecting on resurrection and new life. The emotional healing proved more difficult than the physical. Her older daughter had embarked on what Nancy described as a crusade to disprove the allegations against Frank. The constant questions took their toll. Combined with calls from attorneys and financial institutions, Nancy found herself consumed by anger. Anger at her children, anger at Frank, anger at God for allowing this to happen. In May, Nancy's younger daughter graduated from college in Nashville. She insisted both parents attend. Nancy successfully petitioned the court to temporarily waive the restraining order. The logistics were carefully choreographed so that Nancy and Frank were never in the same space at the same time. During the weekend, both parents separately met with their daughter's boyfriend to give their blessing for his proposal. The graduation fell on Mother's Day weekend. Nancy attended church alone. All three children called with expressions of love and gratitude, but something had shifted. Nancy could no longer pretend she didn't believe their father was guilty. After lengthy mediation sessions that extended late into the night, a property settlement was finally reached. Against her attorney's advice, Nancy agreed to pay for Frank's legal defense against the revocation of his CPA license. She remembered their early partnership and reasoned that he would need his professional credentials if he were acquitted. The divorce was finalized on June 24, 2013. Nancy began the work of selling the family home. She sorted through decades of accumulated memories, the tangible artifacts of a life that no longer existed. The process was painful, though she occasionally found herself laughing at old photographs and forgotten moments. After several failed attempts to find suitable housing, she located a property that felt right. Through what she described as divine intervention, she closed on both the sale of her old home and the purchase of her new home on the same day. For the first time in her life, Nancy would be living completely alone. She named the house Grace Cottage. Grace was the meaning of her first and middle names, and it was only by grace that she was still alive. To supplement her income from the divorce settlement, Nancy took a part-time position with a church family, picking up their children from school and caring for them in the afternoons. As summer turned to fall, Nancy learned she would need another surgery, a tissue graft to repair her damaged eyelid. Around the same time, the district attorney began preparing her to testify at Frank's trial. This meant reviewing all the evidence again, hearing the recordings, reading the transcripts of Frank's conversations with the informant. In her prayer journal, she wrote that she now believed fully and without doubt that Frank had planned to kill her. She asked God for justice. Quick break. Ads keep the show running, but if you want to skip them, the ad-free version's on Patreon for just $3 a month. Links in the show notes. And we're back. Thanks for sticking through that. Let's get back to it. After several postponements, Frank Howard's trial for attempted capital murder began on August 5, 2014, in Denton, Texas. Nancy sat in the gallery behind the prosecution table, supported by her mother and brother. Across the courtroom, Frank sat at the defense table. The trial opened with a recital of exhibits, cell phone numbers, audio recordings, wire transfer receipts. The prosecutor then outlined the conspiracy, a complex, multi-year plot to kill Nancy Howard, with Frank identified as the architect. Nancy took the stand. She described herself as a domestic engineer and detailed the family's involvement in their church. She emphasized that Frank always knew where she was and what she was doing. She testified that their marriage had been strong until the fall of 2009, when Frank's behavior changed. She recounted a conversation that had devastated her. Frank told her, "I'm the right man to be the father of your children, but I'm not the right man to be your husband." The prosecution presented an email Frank had sent Nancy on the morning of the shooting. He wrote that he would be staying in California until Monday. The email ended with the words, "I love you and can't wait to get home to you." Nancy watched the church security footage. The video showed a car stalking her as she left that evening. Then came the 911 recording. Her voice, desperate and afraid, filled the courtroom. Several jurors wiped their eyes. The prosecution displayed her blood-stained purple shirt. During cross-examination, the defense asked about Nancy's younger daughter's wedding, which had taken place in May 2014. Nancy had requested that the judge allow Frank to attend so he could walk their daughter down the aisle. The prosecution called a succession of witnesses, each adding another piece to the narrative. Suzanne Leonteff testified about meeting Frank in July 2009. She detailed the lavish gifts he had given her, nearly $2 million worth. She provided text messages she had sent pressuring him to file for divorce. Billy Earl Johnson took the stand. He testified that Frank, using the alias John, had hired him in early 2010. The directive was simple: kill my wife. Make it look like an accident. Johnson described years of receiving cash and wire transfers from Frank for a murder he never intended to carry out. Stacy Serenko, Johnson's girlfriend, corroborated the plot. She testified that Frank had wanted Nancy killed at her mother's house in San Marcos. If Nancy's mother had to be killed as well, Frank had said she would be collateral damage. Charlie Louderman, an associate of Johnson's, testified that Frank had provided the alarm code for the garage. Frank had also told him about a jewelry box inside the house containing at least $40,000 worth of valuables. The murder was supposed to look like a robbery. Louderman stated that Frank had grown frustrated with the delays. According to Louderman, Frank had said, "Just bring me a gun and I'll do it myself." Stephanie and Jason Rendine testified about learning of the plot from another conspirator, Dustin Hierams. They had then blackmailed Frank for tens of thousands of dollars. Stephanie testified that Frank had asked her if she knew anyone who could take care of it. The defense called Frank and Nancy's 3 children. All 3 described Frank as a good father who had never been violent. They stated their firm belief in his innocence. Detective Michael Wall took the stand. He methodically detailed the evidence. Financial links to the criminals through shell companies with names like Genshu, Snoo, and Sutaho. Phone records. The discovery of the affair. The most damaging evidence came from phone records showing numerous calls between Michael Speck and Frank on the day of the shooting. One call had been placed just 3 minutes after Nancy phoned 911. Frank Howard did not testify. On August 20th, 2014, after deliberating for less than 2 hours, the jury returned a guilty verdict. Frank Howard was convicted of attempted capital murder. Nancy watched his face. It showed no expression, but she could see his chest heaving. During the punishment phase, Nancy delivered a victim impact statement. She described her permanent injuries: chronic nerve pain, loss of her sense of smell, a brain processing delay, the fractured relationships with her children. On August 21st, 2014, the jury sentenced Frank Howard to life in prison with eligibility for parole after 30 years. He would be approximately 85 years old at that point. In a final statement, Nancy looked directly at Frank. She told him she forgave him. Then she pleaded with him. "Tell them the truth," she said. "Release our children from the chains of deceit and lies." A month before the second trial, Michael Speck, the driver of the getaway car, accepted a plea agreement. In exchange for a full confession, he was sentenced to 12 years in prison. In August 2015, Michael Lawrence, the shooter, went to trial in the same courtroom. When he entered, he and Nancy made eye contact. She refused to look away. He pleaded not guilty. Michael Speck testified against his former cellmate. He revealed that he and Billy Earl Johnson had previously stalked Nancy at a Hobby Lobby and a Wendy's, but had aborted both attempts. He stated that he and Lawrence had surveilled Nancy's house the day before the shooting. Originally, Speck was supposed to be the shooter, but Lawrence volunteered because Speck had a young son. Speck described following Nancy from the church, purchasing outfits for the crime at Ross, dropping Lawrence off in the alley, hearing the gunshot, disposing of Nancy's purse, and then returning to retrieve Lawrence's lost hat. Misty Ford, Lawrence's ex-fiancée, repeated the testimony she had given previously. She stated that Lawrence had confessed to her the night of the shooting. He told her he shot her in her garage in the forehead. She added that he had later become violent and threatened her, saying, "The same thing is going to happen to you that happened in Texas." A jailhouse informant named Grady Valentine testified that Lawrence, known in prison as No Good, had admitted to him, "I shot that bitch." After 13 hours of deliberation, the jury found Michael Lawrence guilty of aggravated assault. Due to 2 previous felony convictions, his punishment was enhanced. The jury sentenced him to 60 years in prison. Nancy gave an impact statement directly to Lawrence. She told him she had prayed for him. She told him she forgave him. In the years following the trials, Nancy worked to rebuild her relationships with her children. The trials had left these bonds in what she described as painful shreds. In May 2016, a significant milestone occurred. All 3 of Nancy's children and their spouses celebrated Mother's Day with her. They shared a meal together and took family photographs. The friction and strain of the previous years seemed to dissolve. It was a crucial step toward healing. Nancy's feelings toward Frank evolved. The romantic love was gone, but she continued to love him as the father of her children. She found herself focusing on the life they had once shared, the years when they had been happy as a couple and as parents. The man who had tried to have her killed, the man she called John, remained a stranger to her. She had forgiven both Frank and John, a feat she attributed to supernatural strength. Nancy released herself from the guilt she had carried about the marriage's failure. She no longer questioned what she had done to make Frank hate her. She recognized that she had been a committed wife. Her only mistake had been believing Frank was perfect and incapable of wrongdoing. Nancy took steps to establish a new identity separate from her past. One of the most significant was legally changing her surname back to her maiden name, Shore. The process required fingerprinting at the Denton County Jail, the same facility where Frank and the others had been incarcerated. After her fingerprints cleared FBI databases and a judge signed the order, she officially became Nancy Shore again. She reflected that when she had last been Nancy Shore, she was young and immature. Now she was rebuilding herself with growing peace and confidence. When her part-time nanny position ended, Nancy began working part-time in an office to gain experience. She later took an internship in the legal field. In late January 2017, she secured a full-time position in a legal office. She found the work compatible with her physical disabilities and described waking up excited for the new day for the first time in years. Nancy received occasional income from speaking opportunities, which she hoped to develop into a ministry. She felt called to share her experience of how God could bring blessings from tragedy and to tell broken and lost souls that God loved them and offered forgiveness through Christ. The physical effects of the shooting remained permanent. Nancy continued to see her ocularist, Dr. Randy Tronick, annually. While the prosthetic eye no longer dislodged, she had to perform the painful task of cleaning her eyelid several times each day. She still experienced occasional muscle spasms in her right shoulder and arm, numbness in her forearm and fingers, and partial numbness in her face, nose, and lips. Her mouth and teeth remained hypersensitive. Being touched unexpectedly on her shoulders or neck could still trigger a strong physical and emotional reaction. The brain injury sometimes slowed her concentration. Frank Howard was incarcerated at the Allred Unit in Wichita Falls, Texas. Both of his appeals were denied. Nancy had no direct contact with Frank after the trial. Her only close contact with his family occurred a few months after the verdict, when she called Frank's parents on his birthday to let them know she was thinking of them. They were on their way home from visiting him at the prison. In 2023, Nancy spoke with journalist Fiona Leishman for The Mirror. She stated her belief that Frank had planned to kill her because she wouldn't agree to divorce. As he became involved with his mistress, he wanted to prove his wealth. Before long, he was in over his head. He had no option but to have her shot. Nancy revealed that if Frank had been found not guilty, she would have attempted to fix their relationship and remarry him. The guilty verdict had felt like a kick in the stomach because she still loved him at the time. She clarified that she still loved him, not romantically, but because he was the father of her children. There would always be love there. Despite everything, Nancy had forgiven her husband. She expressed this forgiveness in her victim impact statement at the trial. She explained that the Bible says if we don't forgive those who have harmed us, we are unable to be forgiven. She couldn't afford not to forgive him because she couldn't live with bitterness. By 2018, Nancy hadn't seen or heard from Frank since he was sent to prison. She considered visiting him, but decided against it. She had undergone many surgeries to repair her face and eye, and now had a prosthetic eye. The bullet remained in her lung. She had lost the use of her right arm and hand, but had regained function. She could type again. Nancy expressed gratitude for her life and for the healing happening in her children's lives. She was able to be thankful once again for how God had saved her life.